Hello, welcome to the Paisley Book Festival. Thank you for being here. It's really nice to be here with you and to have a conversation with you about poetry, about translation, about language. My name is Josephine Giles, or Josie for short, and I'm joined today by Juana Adcock and Vahni Anthony Ezekiel Capildeo, who I'm really pleased to be hosting for a conversation on the subject of translation, very broadly. This is the second in a series of events that I've curated for the Book Festival called Minding Language. Yesterday, in an event that you can still watch online, actually, we had a conversation with Raymond Antrobus and Raman Mander on the theme of double language, of working between languages and having more than one language. And tomorrow, we've got the... It's okay, I love sound art. And tomorrow we've got the third and final event in that series with Peter Mackay and Roseanne Watt on island language. And all of these subjects are close to my heart. But today we had this conversation, which I'm so much looking forward to. And I'm going to start by introducing you to these writers, translators, poets, and then we're going to hear a poem from each of them. Great. Where are my bios? Here we go. Juana Adcock is a Mexican-British poet and translator whose work has been published in magazines such as Magma, Kenyan Review, Modern Poetry in Translation, and several anthologies in the UK, Mexico, and further afield. Her English language debut poetry collection, Split, was a Book Society choice and was included in The Guardian's Best Poetry of 2019. Vahni Anthony Ezekiel Capildeo is a Trinidadian Scottish writer of poetry and non-fiction. Capildeo's 8 books and 8 pamphlets include Like a Tree Walking from Carcanet and The Dusty Angel, both in 2021. I've not written it down, it's from Guillemot, is that right? Dusty
No,
Angel.
it's The Dusty Angels from Oystercatcher.
Oystercatcher, not Guillemot, different birds. Their interests include plurilingualism, traditional masquerade, and multidisciplinary collaboration. They are writer-in-residence and professor at University of York, a visiting scholar at Pembroke College, Cambridge, and an honorary student at Christ Church, Oxford. And please welcome Anthony and Juana with a round of applause. So Juana, I think we're going to begin with you. And would you like to take it away with a poem, which you can either introduce for us or not, as your preference has it?
Yeah, well, since we're doing an event about translation, I thought I'd write a poem that I wrote specifically about translation, and it's called The Task of the Translator. I took the title from an essay by Walter Benjamin, and yeah, I think it's kind of my idealistic view of translation, let's say. The Task of the Translator. Hold the concept as a dear hand. Learn its scars, its temperature, the parts hardened by work, the weight with which it will lead or be led. One day, try words on, one after the other, like rings. Another day, the first ring chosen, a perfect fit. How joyfully the metal glints for having found, printed on skin, by lack of sun, a band as if the ring had been there all along.
Thank you. Oh yes, please. It's really beautiful. I love the honor that you give the work of translation there, and I suppose the sort of intimacy of it as well, this skin contact of translation. It's maybe an obvious question in response to that, but what first drew you to that task of a translator? What made you start wanting to do that? How did you find your way to it?
Well, the first ever poem that I translated, I was actually quite young. I was in primary school, and I just had found this poem and I really wanted to share it with my friends, but they didn't speak the language, so I thought, oh, I'll just translate it. And in a way, that was kind of a sneaky way to kind of appropriate the poem and kind of make it my own, and, you know, maybe even show off a little bit and just share this thing that felt quite expansive. But then later on, I got more into translation from a commercial side. It just became my day job, and that became an interesting way to deal with it as well, because I think it kind of affected my writing process and just how I view the world in general.
In what way?
Yeah.
What way?
Well, it's something about being able to rely on somebody else's words and just put yourself at the service of that, and kind of the humility it takes somehow to just kind of be the receiver and then try and make yourself a kind of channel or something for what is being said. And so it's kind of almost this practice of meditation for me, where you're kind of trying to get away from your own ego and see what's being said. And I think a very big danger in translation is that our brains always want to read what we want to read. We want to find ourselves in the text, and so a lot of the time the practice is about trying to see what's actually there, which isn't quite as straightforward as it may seem sometimes.
Thank you. Channeling, receiving, serving. These are all really interesting kind of words for translation, and I think we're going to dig into that quite a bit. But first, Anthony, I'd really like to hear from you with different approaches to translation. So what have you brought for us to hear first?
Hi. Thank you. The first thing I've brought is a small lullaby that I wrote for my 2013 book, which is called Utter, and was published by the Leeds-based Caribbean interest publisher Peepal Tree Press. And it's trying to show the state of mind, if you live between different languages, the state of mind you can go into as you're falling asleep, and nobody is forcing you to pretend to speak only in one language. All the words smoosh into each other, smoosh, of course, being a highly technical term. And I was talking about this in a workshop that Alicia Per Mohammed was kindly hosting the other day at the University of Edinburgh. And I was talking to the workshop participants about the languages we experience sleep in and what languages we might use for pets or lullabies, and how even if we're in a place where a particular language, such as Standard English, is the administrative dominant language, that when we're in domestic contexts or situations of urgency, or if we're swearing or cooking or patting a dog, there are these other words and phrases, this other syntax, which seems to come out with greater intimacy and immediacy. To sleep, possum to dream. Possum descending a stairwell, a step ladder, numbers of sleep rounded up. Possum defending sealed caves of seal sheep, sea clouds, here merely daisies, telling a petaled profusion of slumbering possum, enameled possum logging out early. Possum without compass seeks haystacks and haystacks, thorough, innavigable, cringly acres. Impossible n'est pas français. Possum's nest, nest pas français. A possum cantabile, possum untrainable, the nest unscheduled stop. The nest is silence, the deepest possumism. Opossum knows, possum wakes only for possum. So accordingly, all possibilities hold.
Beautiful. What a cheeky beginning. I love it. Possibilities. I was really struck listening to that, by how specific sounds were guiding you through the poem, guiding the reader through the poem. This the plosive P and the sibilant S, very different sounds in the mouth, but you're following them through different languages and different states. What's that role of sound for you in this work?
Well, that for me, well, first of all, I'm very interested in listening into silence. So what you're saying, Juana, about channeling was very good to hear, because I think if we listen into silence rather than listening for an idea or words, then different patterns can come through. But talking a little bit about silence, one of the reasons that I quite like masks is I frequently have no words. Because I grew up between several languages, but with incomplete vocabularies in each one. And what then happens is if I try to code switch, instead of getting a translation, I often just get a blank. So if you suddenly asked me what's the French for this or what's the Spanish for that, and I hadn't been thinking in the Spanish or French word mode, it would be as if I had no words. And so what I quite like about the mask is I can pull faces like behind the mask when I'm feeling like this, and nobody knows I'm doing that. I can go into my languageless animal mode. Well, one of the important things about translation for me is that translation of sound and what is carried over from one language to another. So when I was studying Old Norse, there was somebody in our class who knew Russian as well, and she's saying that the translations from Old Norse into Russian were much more poetically effective because they could translate more of the binding together by the qualities of sound than we could get in contemporary standard English. And so why I felt that To Sleep, Possum to Dream was partly a poem about translation is because it shows how one sound can be generative of another, and that kind of singing in a language. And for me, a translation which doesn't do that is not a faithful one. One that gives you the dictionary meaning but doesn't tell you anything about how the text sings hasn't really done its work. I'm going to put my mask on so I can make funny faces.
Thank you for that. And there was a number of different threads there that I now want to pick up. We're going to open out this conversation now between the three of us, and I should say, prep your questions because we'll have time for audience questions before the end. However, I have forgotten to bring any form of timekeeping device onto the stage. Jess, could you give me a wave when we're at like 4:45, so I know that's time for audience questions? Would that be okay? Thank you. I'll keep an eye for a wave. So you both spoke to something in different ways there, tuning into silence, tuning into somebody else's words, both ways of putting your own self back a little bit from the poem, which is almost counterintuitive for how a lot of poetry is written. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, maybe starting with you, Anthony, about what is that process for you of not necessarily putting yourself forward when you are translating an experience, translating an idea, translating a poem?
I don't think I'm a particularly nice or good person, so it's less about avoiding the ego and more about distrust of the noise of the everyday. This is something I was thinking about when I was reading some of Sam Riviere's earlier work and how well Sam manages to sculpture the material of everyday interfering noise. But what I try to do is an act of anti-colonial or anti-capitalist resistance, which is try to quiet all the phrases and accents which have barreled their way into my mind, but are not necessarily what my mind wishes to concern itself with. So the silence is as much a practice of resistance. And I remember trying to talk about this years ago in Cambridge and being accused by someone of talking about a privileged practice of retreat. But for me, it's much less a retreat and much more a quelling. So almost like a quelling of the monsters of noise to find out what has really been going on. And I know this seems to be suggesting there's an authentic preoccupation that one has. I don't really want to get into whether there is an authentic preoccupation. I can just tell you what it feels like. It feels like if you've been in a very cramped train, you can get out of the train and stretch. When I get out of all the noise that the day has put into my head and into that place of silence, it's as if whatever makes poetry in my head has a chance to stretch. There's that sort of feeling.
That makes a lot of
Liberation,
sense to me as somebody who's also very overwhelmed by noise, by the noise of the world. What for you, Juana, are you trying to tune into? What's getting in the way of the translation work that you want to do, and what is it that you're trying to tune into?
Well, I don't know. Something about what you were saying reminded me of translating sort of non-literary texts as well, because in order to be able to translate anything, you have to peel back so many layers of things that are going on. And I don't know if you're translating a government document or something official, you find in this official language a lot of kind of states of denial and renaming of things to make certain actions more justifiable or easier to do and to conduct. And so when you are trying to put that into a different language, you're kind of aware of all those mechanisms, and then it can be, this kind of ethical decision of like, do I bring this out more? Do I, try and quieten it down or so on? And so from that point of view, it can be very difficult. And for me, often when I have done that is when a poem might leap out to me from a translation that I'm doing. It's like, oh, this is what I want to write about now. It's about that noise and how am I going to speak back almost. Yeah.
So let's dig a bit more into this politics of translation. Anthony just dropped the idea of an anti-colonial poetic practice, and there's a challenge, I think, or maybe an opportunity for those of us working in English, in forms of English, but also in other languages that have a relationship to English that is often a relationship of power, often a relationship of conflict. How do you, Juana, negotiate that? Are you seeking an anti-colonial approach to translation? What for you is going on when you bring a work into English or out of English?
Yeah, I would say that probably lots of languages in the world are in a colonial relationship with the English language because it's so dominant. Even in Spanish, we're seeing the language is constantly evolving and kind of Englishifying itself, as if this is making it, as if this were more prestigious, like a more prestigious way to speak. And I feel really, really resistant to that. And so when I use Spanish, I want to bring out forms that maybe aren't Englishified, let's say, also a very technical term. And yeah, also paying attention to indigenous languages that are spoken. For example, in Mexico, I think it's 64 indigenous languages that are spoken, and they're not seen as very, very prestigious, or only in very recent years have people started to pay some attention to writers writing in these languages. And I think that's really, really important, because probably each language has its own way of viewing the world and its own set of values and cultural nuances that are really important to pay attention to. And instead of kind of seeing English as this prestigious thing, I keep saying it, but it really is the case, that people want to write as if they're somehow in a good relationship with the English language, and I find it really, really disturbing. So yeah, resisting that as much as possible, and translating authors from indigenous languages, even if I don't speak the language, which it becomes a different kind of practice, but it's also really, interesting and important to me.
Yeah, I certainly relate to that. Having a hostile relationship. I feel hostile to the English language. Even when I'm writing in it, I feel I'm having a battle with it a lot of the time. Anthony, for you, what is this anti-colonial practice of translation or of versioning or of writing? How does that show up in your own work? And what battles are you having with or in English?
Unfortunately, I had about 5 different ideas while Juana was talking, because what you're saying was inspiring in so many fronts, and I was longing to hear you read from, but maybe a little bit later, from your translations. But one of the things I was thinking about is maximal versus minimal translation, which is not a real technical term either. But I was trying to think about why it is that I'm not satisfied to write one version of a poem, and why, if I'm doing a translation or a version, but I keep trying to unpeel that poem into other things that don't even necessarily resemble the original. And it occurred to me it's because I don't want the poem necessarily to have notes, but I do want it to create its own context. And so somehow by having 4 or 5 or 6 or 18 versions, say one of which channels a sound, another which will explain the background, another which will be more descriptive of the setting, of whatever, that in that sense, that kind of more maximal approach can almost safeguard the poem against being mistranslated, in the sense of translation being taking a thing from one place to another. I'm sorry, I've probably used this example before when I'm talking to people, and I'm middle-aged, so I can repeat myself. Sorry, that's a terrible thing to say. But when I was talking about Jean Rhys about 20 years ago with some undergraduates, and I gave them a passage where the West Indian author Jean Rhys references a flamboyant tree, which is a specific species of tree with a silvery trunk and red flowers. Nobody had looked it up. They all assumed that Jean Rhys just meant flamboyant in the general sense, an extravagant tree. And one of them brought in a moral value judgment and said, ha ha, look, the narrator wants a flamboyant tree, not just any tree. And I said, well, no, this is specifically a flamboyant tree, a kind of tree which is associated, in fact, with the passage of the soul of the dead to the higher realms of the spirit world, if you're so lucky as to be buried under it. So there's an actual significance to it, as well as all the colors you have to be imagining and the shape, this extraordinary sort of umbrella of fire. And that's a kind of unconscious misreading where I would, for example, if I were translating an Old English poem and there was a word that meant burden and gift, I would want to do several different versions of the poem, and in one you'd get the sense of gift at the opening, in another you'd get the sense of burden. And rather than pretend that we can somehow put ourselves in the place of a reader of that poem univocally, that it's more like we would dwell with the poem would haunt us over and over, the poem would inhabit us and present different faces to us, a bit like the difference between talking to somebody for an hour like we're doing here and seeing them day in, day out for a month. And I think that's why I like doing multiple versions as an act of anti-colonial maximal poetics of the imagination, a kind of generosity of the imagination of the original, rather than trying to pretend there's a one-to-one mapping.
So there's something there about resistance to one authorized truth, or resistance to a perfect translation.
Yes.
Which is maybe an illusion that the sort of the supposed transparency of English or the historical practices of English give us the idea that in English we can't find this one truth. Is there something in there that you're undoing? Or?
It's possibly that, but I think it's also possibly less to do with the potential of language itself than the impoverishment of the English language imagination. So if certain things haven't been represented in whatever canonical or prize-winning or mainstream English language literature might be, then when you say that thing, for example, if you take a completely neutral phrase like almond eyes, then if you look at the phrase almond eyes in a culture where you translate that into the original language and it is praiseworthy, then it's a praiseworthy phrase. Whereas if you take the phrase almond eyes and you understand it in a context where people who are not white are often spoken about in terms of food or something to be consumed or traded, then almond eyes becomes less of a compliment. So this is about the wider cultural context. What can you then do? Can you just kind of write lots of very foodie literature about people and hope that if people are also written about as monstrous foods, that they'll be less easily consumed? Or can you just say that you can't easily use a phrase like almond eyes and assume that the value from the source culture is going to go over into the target one? Neutral example.
Thank you. You dropped a couple of words in those wonderful thoughts, the translation and the version, and there's a tension between those two words, isn't there? That a translation and a version are slightly different things. What for you is the difference between translation, version, original poem? What are we meaning by these words, and is there a meaningfully different approach to them?
Yeah, I'll keep it quite short because I'm quite keen to hear Juana's translations, and I think for me translation is tied up with the long tradition of commercial translation and commercial literary translation, which you might expect to see reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement or commissioned for Penguin Classics. And there the idea is of a text which is going to represent itself, if not as authoritative, at least as the best we can do at this time, or the one we can all commonly refer to. So there's this idea of standardization through accessibility. It's not necessarily an act of power, it can also be just an act of pragmatic generosity. And it might want to have endnotes and footnotes or whatever. Then of course there isn't really necessarily such a thing as a stable originary text. So I mean, if you're looking at something like trying to do a version of Julian Norwich, you've got at least two versions of Julian's text, as well as the knowledge that she had rethought her own text over half her entire lifetime. So what are you actually translating? Version for me has got two possibilities. One is, because I am cynical, I said I wasn't a nice person. One is somebody overprivileged getting to claim the prestige of some probably unacknowledged person who speaks a minoritized language, who'll have helped them to do an incredibly pretentious and indulgent departure from a text. So it'll be, I am the incredibly famous such and such person and I'm going to read you my version. And meantime, there's somebody, somebody at home just gritting their teeth thinking, I got 30 quid for spending 6 months with this guy thrashing out the crib version, and many is never going to pair in anything. But then the other version of version is something where there's an enriching play of the imagination and a kind of really full engagement with unpeeling and unpacking all the possibilities you can, a sort of restlessness and joy.
That certainly chimes with some of my own understandings, and I think a lot there about the power in the translator-translated relationship. What do these words mean to you, Juana, and how do you approach translation or version or original authorship differently? Are they different things for you?
Yeah, well, we were talking earlier about the difference between translating from a language that you speak and translating from languages that you don't speak. I would probably be, if I don't speak the language, I would call it maybe more of a version. And then if it's a language that I do speak, a translation. And it's quite a different process. Translating from languages that I don't speak is maybe a lot more freeing in a way. I'm not constrained by what the original says. We are supposed to be constrained. That's a joke. It's somehow allows you to go a bit further with it. Whereas in translation, maybe because I've been so used to doing commercial translation and, needing to be really faithful to what it says on the original text. I feel it's quite hard to depart from that. But what I do need to do is make something that reads well in the target language and that works as a poem. And so you're kind of doing a bit of both. It's maybe translating, but also versioning in a way. I might read some of the translations just because when you were speaking, it reminded me of a couple of the translations from Hubert. Is that okay?
I'd like that very much, yeah.
So Hubert Matiwa, he is from the state of Guerrero in Mexico, and he writes in this language called Mepa. I'll just read it. We've come to ask you to lead the way with your silence. May your tongue protect us with a whisper, us, your young, barely a water spring. This glowworm, clothing the swamp where your sap emerges. Your lip was a blanket of moonrise which sank the storm of the oak trees. We've come to you with our stomachs stone and flesh to offer up the thunder of your dead. Here the blood is tied. The wind's saliva is tied. The path where we start to feel we are different. There's another poem I want to read, but I just need to find it. But it was making me think about what you were saying about the impoverishment of the English imagination and how lots of the set phrases that we have in what we would call poetic language are really not neutral at all, and they have a whole tradition, and it's really a big part of our work as translators is to kind of navigate those known landscapes or something of the English language and try and transform it and try and push the boundaries of what English language is expected to do and expected forms of speech or something. And then when you were talking about the kind of famous poet coming in and helping these poor people, it reminded me of this poem in particular, which has 3 different voices, and each voice is a different way to relate to the indigenous population, the indigenous communities of the Mepa. So I'll just read it. Here come the unwashed, brown, fern-footed, wrapped in their moth-eaten cloaks, stinking of their funeral herbs. Say those who look from afar, sowing poverty. Here come the righteous with their slingshots hunting for justice, covering their skin in mountain ashes, stopping the kidnap of their young. Say the well-meaning. Here come the makers of signs. They fill our hat with dreams. They waken our dead, says grandmother.
Thank you. Thank you for reading those poems and for the work of translating them. A couple of things came up there when you were talking about them, to do with translating an indigenous language into English and translating a highly minoritized language into English, in this case for the first time for a poet. And there's sort of a double thing that's going on there, right? In that the global nature of English brings this language, this text, these ideas, these ways of thinking to a large audience and can bring something useful of the attention of that audience for that language. And yet there's also, as you were saying earlier, risks with English, because English is such a dominant language and its gaze as a language can, as in that poem, transform what it looks at. So it's a very big question, but as a translator, how do you approach that? how do you make English work towards the ends you want it to, and how do you avoid falling into its traps, I suppose?
I don't know. I think an important thing for me is allowing it to just sound odd, because a lot of the time, and I've worked in co-translations as well. You know, a lot of the time we want to rescue the text and make it sound good and so on. And actually, no. Like, maybe our work is to just allow it to sound odd. What do you mean, the face of the wind? Well, this is what the poet is talking about, and the wind has a face, and maybe it will interfere with certain set phrases that we already have in English that are very common, and it's allowing it to sit there and to be uncomfortable, I think. Yeah. I don't go so much into the versioning and doing like 18 different versions of the poem, because I think my mind wouldn't be able to encompass that, but I really like the idea. I feel like if I tried to do that, my brain might explode, but it's so fascinating to be able to think about all the different multiple possibilities in a poem or something. Yeah.
Thank you. We were talking a bit backstage about how English itself is not just one language, and there's actually lots of different Englishes and lots of different approaches to English. So, Anthony, how do you deploy, I suppose, different approaches to English to work through some of these problems that we've been kind of talking about on stage?
I was having a slightly different but related thought, though I will try to answer your question and be good for a change.
No need to be good. No need to be good whatsoever.
Okay, in that case I shan't answer your question directly. So the slightly different thought I was having is that when we traveled pre-pandemic and encountered what seems to be English, or say if you've got another language like French or Spanish, which is widely disseminated, you realize it's not the same language at all, and there is in fact an active language, for example, among innovative Indian English poets I know, where they still use these, to me, very Edwardian-sounding words like balderdash. And so one of them told me copyright is balderdash. When I asked him for permission to quote one of his works, he said, of course, because we would have none of the Vedas if we had copyright. It's balderdash. And how can we pretend that English is one when, as practicing poets or readers, in our everyday life, we're always encountering different Englishes, and then yet somehow on the field of the page, we expect English to have a kind of dress code. It's very, very strange. Then I don't know whether any of you have read Damon Runyon, the American author who wrote in a kind of gangster speak. I didn't really understand it at all, but an American friend of mine who was a classicist was determined I should read it anyway. It was a bit like my first experience of reading Irvine Welsh before I had moved to Scotland. So it's just like a similar density of language that is particular to a certain kind of urban living. And while it's true that the concepts carried along with that, it's also true that it's very much a surface difference that is making the language feel different. And what I'm interested in more and more is not whether the English language looks different on the surface, but as their fundamentally different concept underneath apparently the same word. So if I use the word red in a particular poem, will something about that poem in English or the audience or the publishing house make people think about communism, or will it make them think about bloodshed, or will it make them think about shame? So what is the kind of set of concepts being activated in the apparently simple words? And how is it that different audiences will have such very different fields of reference So almost like the more simple you make your poem look, the more complicated the foundational concepts are going to be. And then what is it like when you're translating from languages with different foundational concepts? I was talking about this with Alice Conran when she and I were working on Welsh, Spanish and English together. And she was saying that there was one, I won't even try saying it in Welsh because I'll just butcher it, but there was one verb which meant roughly to return, which kept on coming over and over in the poem that we were looking at. But she was explaining how there'd be different durations, different tensions, different spatialities of the sense of return, different activations of that business of returning, which were not being carried over from the Welsh to English just because the verbal systems are so different. To say return, return, return with an apparent simplicity is a terrible mistranslation of the concepts.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you, you pretended to refuse to answer my question, but I think you did. But I'm really glad that you took that form of refusal. I think it might be a good moment to open this up to the audience, but can I just get a quick time check on where we're at? My internal clock's really good. Do any of you have questions for our writers here that you'd like to ask? Or are you just completely struck into silence by the depth of this conversation? It's not test. Yes, in the middle there.
Killing a person. Absolutely. I mean, it's always that temptation, isn't it? Let's just subvert, the text. And I think poetry is a really fun way to go in there and subvert those texts. And lots of poets do that. They take official documentation and then start playing around with those terms, even from English into English, and just try and interrogate those absurd terms that are being used in order to justify certain actions. And in terms of delivering work to a client, I've not had the opportunity to deal with such high-level documents, but otherwise I would have maybe tried to. Most of what I translate at the moment is to do with adoption, like international adoptions, and they're quite kind of Catholic in their ideas of because it's a Catholic organization, and so it's ideas about family, and it's stuff that I maybe don't agree with, but like I'm just doing the job, so I just do it, but I end up thinking a lot and overheating my brain. Yeah.
Are there forms of mischief that you like making, Anthony, when you're translating or versioning?
Well, I don't do commercial translation in the way that you do, Rana, so in a way I can be as naughty as I like. But what I was thinking of with the question was an amazing collection of poetry, which I keep recommending, which is Solmaz Sharif, S-H-A-R-I-F, Look, which came out, I think, a couple of years ago. And there Solmaz Sharif takes the American Military Dictionary, which takes perfectly ordinary seeming words like look, and gives specialist technical military meanings which have no apparent relation to them. And she puts these two languages together in her poems in the most extraordinary way, and using the words from the military dictionary, when she uses them in the military sense, she'll put them in tiny capital letters, but then gradually you go into this sort of overheated brain state where you no longer know if you're reading a poem about family or love, or if you're reading a poem about surveillance and killing. And she shows how both life and language have got doubled in that sense. it is mischievous, but in that survivalist mischief way of being mischievous because you don't have the power to change the system. So what you do is produce an elaborate mockery of it and show that although it has power, it's a hollow power.
I really like, I'm going to take that line with me, that survival is mischief. That's really necessary. Does anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask? Please.
Yeah. I haven't done a huge amount of translating poetry in form, but when I have done it, it seems to kind of almost, sometimes, not always, but sometimes it seems to be easier because it's giving you more of a direction and where to take it. And obviously it depends on the poem. Some poems, maybe this part is really important. Maybe another poem, you just don't want to pay that much attention to the form. It's always, a case-by-case scenario. But I'm often surprised by how easily a poem in form can go into form. Whereas when I'm writing my own work, I can't do form somehow. But translating it seems somehow easier. I don't know. What about you, Vahni?
I was thinking, as you were speaking there, about the importance of having many different translations for any one poem, because I like it when people try to do that. But then there's also the question of cultural translatability. So what if what the poem is doing in its original or source language doesn't mean the same? Mm-hmm. So if you use the same amount of alliteration in modern English that you would have in Old English or Old Norse, the association we have would be a kind of comic song from a 1920s music hall, and that wouldn't be the intended effect. But then the other thing about form is sorry, this is going to sound so pretentious, but what do you mean by form? I was working with a Japanese poet. They don't know any Japanese, but he knew English and French. And we were looking at one of his poems, which was to do with people going over a bridge, which had various artistic architectural features that the people going over the bridge were responding to, and then also mist rising from the river. And he was using the capability of the Japanese alphabet to suggest several concepts at once, to create cloudiness or mistiness in the lines. So at first he had been producing a very neat translation that went into quite conventional looking lines of English, and you could have matched up one line of English and one with the Japanese, but there was no feeling of cloudiness. And I said to him, well, what we're translating here so far is a dictionary sense of each line, but the whole point of your poem is this cloudy atmosphere upon the bridge with the artworks and the river and the mist and the people passing to and fro. So what if we use something experimental on the page to suggest the gaps and the hesitations? What if we start introducing indeterminacies? So what then happened was that to translate a certain aspect of what Japanese can do in one way, we took a different tradition of innovation in English language poetry to show cloudiness and gappiness another way. So,
Yeah, but that's a question that I ask myself a lot when I'm translating a text. It's what is the text actually doing, and how can I make it do that in the other language? And each poem, each text will have its own thing that it wants you to do, I think. And for me, tuning into that is really important.
You know, I'm going to chip in here because I have my own quite sort of strong feelings about this, which is that like, I have a sort of resistance to the idea that any poem is not in a form. That I think especially in the work of translation, the idea of free verse or a poem that isn't in a form is almost misleading, because even in a poem that isn't a sonnet or isn't in quartameter or whatever, the line length has meaning, the sound patterning has meaning, that when I'm translating from so-called free verse, I am still trying to replicate line length or communicate something of the line length of the original. I'm still trying to communicate something of the sound patterning of the original. Or if the original is avoiding those things, then I have to try and avoid them in English as well, or do something. That's something that I work at. So there's always a form there for me. I don't know. That's my own approach to it. And like, I have, as a poet that is quite formal and very sound based, often I find I have to resist my own temptations to make everything sound nice, because I love sound patterns and I like even lines and things like that, and I have to steer away from those instincts for myself. I don't know if that says anything to, if either of you disagree or have your own approaches there.
No, I think it's quite nice to think of all forms as form, and you know, why should we only talk about sonnets or so on? No, that's a really good point.
I think that's really interesting, because we might be using the word form in more than one way. Because in a way, what I was hearing there, Josie, was the pattern of the original poem being in itself the new form. So that's the kind of creation. Do you see what I mean? Whereas I think the other sense in which we're using form is something formalist. You know, so something more formalist, where there's a pattern where you have to be able to cut it out. It's like if I were going to cut out something and tell you it's an angel, and it had a sort of blob forehead and then a T underneath, you could probably agree that conventionally that's an angel. But if I cut something out and it was shaped like a popsicle, you would probably have a little bit more difficulty at seeing it as other than a decapitated angel. But sorry, that's a terrible example.
No, it makes complete sense. And even then, I have my own kind of struggles there. So I do a lot of translating between English and Scots. And every so often I tackle a sonnet, and I'm like, can't do a sonnet in Scots. Scots sonnets, they don't feel right. Scots is so dactylic as a language that if I try and make it iambic, it's just horrible. So I just end up like changing the form. I'm like, what form in Scots is a bit like a sonnet?
I love that. Scots is so dactylic, and you go like this.
Oh yeah, I'm just waving my fingers. I'm rambling too much. We've probably got time for one more question, and then some final points. If anyone has another question, please. No, how do you translate sound into text? How do you translate orality into literality? Yeah.
Well, I weirdly, I always need to perform my translations before. Well, if it's going to be poetry translations, I like to perform them before publishing them, and it allows me to. Really embody the sound and embody the poem. And what you were saying about allowing the poem to just inhabit you for a few days and just live in that poem somehow. And then, you know, the writing it down becomes more of a technical thing, almost like an afterthought. At least for me, that's what it might feel like.
So now I'm going to use one of those cliches that we've all spoken against, and say it's also a matter of letting go, because there's no way that anything we say is ever received in exactly the sense we mean it, and that's even if we can be relied upon to know what we mean ourselves. So I think there's a point where you just have to go for it and then let it go. Otherwise, you end up rewriting the same thing over and over, one poem for your whole life.
To give a third and totally different answer, I will say that I started as a performance poet. I started as an oral poet, and that turned me. When I started trying to write on the page, that turned me into a visual poet. That to get the tools that I had when I was speaking, I needed to use the whole canvas of the page, and I got very interested in spatial arrangements of text, because only those could do some of what sound could do in the air. That's what words could do in space. And so I've become more and more visual as a poet because I'm so committed to sound. That's my own answer. I'd really love, I think we've got time, yes, to hear maybe one or two short poems from each of you to finish off of your choice. Yeah, Anthony, would you like to go first this time, if you've got something you'd like to share? It can be completely off topic if you like.
No, this is going to be on topic. It's from a pamphlet called Light Sight, which was published by Periplum Press. And this was my naughty pamphlet, in a sense. So I had just written Odyssey Calling, which had got some very exact responses to the Odyssey and so on. And Light Sight was where I let myself play as outrageously as I wanted to. So this was partly done for Zoe Schoolding's expanded translation network. And I was looking at Ionesco, the French language playwright. And in particular, I was looking at the way Ionesco himself would use long, absurd lists and cascades of language, where he liked making effects which come when words pile up and actions pile up absurdly and produce themselves in ways that seem illogical. So what I say here, and I'm reading it out because I don't have a lot of thoughts tonight. The processes of expanded translation here attempted, following Ionesco's technical pointers, include allowing words the liberty to unspool without explicit initial regard to meaning, for example, by free association or by sound quality. This generative approach permits the language of the unconscious to be translated into a language of clarity and everydayness while keeping both in play. So I'm reading one really short one, and I called it Alliterative Diamond. And the sentence is from Ionesco and from an extended interview published as Entre la vie et le rêve, Between Life and Dream. The sentence is Quand j'étais plus jeune, j'avais des réserves lumineuses. He's discussing an epiphany he had, a revelation, where he seemed to see everything in the world illuminated, and even and particularly beginning with laundry hanging on a line, he saw everything as absolutely luminous. So I just looked at this, Quand j'étais plus jeune, j'avais des réserves lumineuses. When I was young, when younger, I had light stockpiled, step wells of luminosity, seams of gleaming, inward glow. Brightness had my back, hot buttresses, radiant underpinnings, unreserved reservoirs. My fashion walked sun rays, failings wheeled to sunrise. Doing was floating, dear and perpetual. Shining went into me, should not go out. Look, we have resources. My life, you have my light. Then one of the little one from that Ionesco series where he just says, I'm going to ask you to read this, Josie, which I shouldn't really have done.
Oh,
but
okay, yes.
It's called Lightbox. And there's just one sentence. He says, c'est la lumière, la cité de lumière. La lumière, c'est le monde transfiguré. It's light, the city of light. Light is the world transfigured. And so I took out the French words, put in the English words, and put in Scots words, and then mixed them into the shape of a heart. So if you want to read the list, Josie.
I will attempt to do so.
Yeah.
Oh,
just
yes.
the list, yeah. Because I'm not going to try to do Scots anymore than I'm going to try to do Welsh.
So we've got French and English and Scots. Okay. Yeah, my French is very rusty.
No, not as bad as my Scots, I can tell you.
Amour, beam, brecht, brilliance, clarity, clear, clear, continual, éclatant, épiphanie, glorieux, glowing, illumination, le mans, licht, light, lumière, lumineux, luminosity, merveille, perpetual, radiance, radieux, radius, resplendir, shined, shire, sheer, shining, splendor, sunray, transfiguration. Something like that?
Thank you, exactly like that.
Oh, I got a clap. That's nice. Hannah, what would you like to give us to finish off?
Well, I'd like to read one of Aubert's, actually. It's just a short one. Our language will take root at water springs. Always it will hang among leaves, scaling the stalks, till it grows into a tree.
Thank you. A perfect ending. Thank you. Juana Adcock and Vahni, Anthony, Ezekiel, Capildeo. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. What do I need to say to finish off? We have a third event in this language series tomorrow afternoon with Peter Mackay and Roseanne Watt, which you can watch online. There are plenty of other events in the Paisley Book Festival. Please check out the rest of the programme. It's such a glorious programme. You can buy books from both Juana and Anthony at the Book Festival shop just round the corner. Other than that, I think it just remains to say thank you for coming, and please again give Anthony and Hannah a round of applause for this wonderful conversation.